Thank you so much, everyone, for coming on the reading day of the semester. This is our last care event for the semester, and we're really excited to be here at the STEAM Factory. I'll tell you a little bit about, so basically some of you have been to these before and some are new STEAM members. So the CARE is conversations about research ethics, and it's brought to you by the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and it's sponsored by the Office of Research with the help of the Center for Bioethics and the College of Public Health. And basically, I mean, the reason why we're here and the reason why we're talking about this is Becky Jackson really suggested early on in the planning, she was one of the advisory board members for the CARE programming, and she suggested that it was really important to bring in the STEAM Factory and STEAM members because it's such an interdisciplinary collaborative group of faculty, of researchers, postdocs, graduate students. And so I reached out to the STEAM listserv and asked people what they were interested in. And two topics came up that they thought were really important, that they would love to have sort of an interdisciplinary conversation related to research ethics. One was on advocacy and sort of both the opportunities and the challenges related to being a researcher and also being an advocate for a specific cause. And the other was on authorship. So look in the fall for a topic on authorship. And basically both of those, I think, relate to the potential for these kinds of conversations where the point is to have these interdisciplinary conversations to actually like pick each other's brains and to see that there are actual really challenges that we're facing, and sometimes within a specific field, people are like, well, this has been already discussed and settled, right? It's not even a question, like why are we even talking about this, right? And then I think it's sometimes useful to have that cross-disciplinary conversation to see why it is that people still think that there's potential issues related to it. We can learn something from each other. So that's sort of the overview of the CARE program. So far, our topics have been on conflicts of interest in research, the ethical issues concerning reproducibility in research, and engaging in research in humanitarian crises. And so this final one, I think, is going to be a really nice informal conversation that I hope all of us will be part of about research and advocacy. Many of us come to our research interests because we are really committed and we care about a specific issue. And sometimes we become advocates or learn about our deep commitments as a result of our research. And navigating that relationship, I think, is really important and ethically interesting. So we have a really exciting panel. Our external speaker is Dr. LaKisha Simmons. She's coming from the University of Michigan. She's in the Department of History and Women's Studies there. LaKisha wrote the book Crescent City Girls, The Lives of Young Black Women in Segregated New Orleans, which won like a ton of prizes. She's worked on like the subject of Black girlhood as sort of a growing field, and she's been thinking about that in a lot of different ways, and she's recently working on also motherhood, and so a new paper is coming out on Beyonce's Lemonade, and so you should look out for that. And she was also the co-creator of an International Global History of Black Girlhood conference in UVA 2 years ago. So thank you so much for LaKisha. And what we're going to be doing is LaKisha's going to come and present for about 15 minutes about how she's been thinking about advocacy and research. And then we're going to have Jeremy Bruskotter and Jessie Kweik, also talk. So Jeremy is from the School of Environmental and Natural Resources. He works on understanding how people make conservation-related decisions, especially when it comes to wildlife. And Jesse is a microbiologist that also works in epidemiology and has been thinking about HIV and especially maternal blood transmission of HIV, maternal fetal blood transmission. And so each of them are going to sort of give their own views of how they've thought about research and advocacy and how advocacy has motivated their work. And then we've come up with a few questions that we're going to be talking about, and that is going to be open up to all of you. So this is a nice intimate group, so I want to make sure that everyone that has questions gets a chance to ask them. So to move further, LaKisha.
Hi everyone. I have a PowerPoint, that. Right on time. Thank you. That I put together just to remind me of what I should talk about. So that's why I have this. And I was thinking about the word advocacy, and I don't really self-identify as an advocate, but I was thinking about the ways in which I try to think about public and civic engagement in my research and my teaching. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And you know, we could open up the conversation later if people are interested on exactly what an advocate is and what that looks like. Because maybe I could call myself that too. Okay, so research. So I have been doing work on Black girlhood, and it started with my book, which is on Black girls in New Orleans. And since that time, I've been engaging a lot more with Black girls and also with public history, if you will, in a lot of different kinds of ways. And one of that is by running Black girlhood conferences that include girls themselves. And when I was writing my book, I wrote about Black girls in Jim Crow New Orleans in the 1930s and 1940s. So I wasn't thinking specifically about Black girls. And it wasn't until after I published my research that I really started thinking about Black girls and working with Black girls in terms of my research, but also just in terms of engagement and bringing my research to Black girls themselves. And also writing in a way that Black girls was accessible to Black girls. So I'm working right now on a co-edited anthology called The Global History of Black Girlhood. And part of what we're doing, because we understand the need for this kind of book, both for the undergrad level, but also lower levels and like after school programs and different things like that. One of the things we're doing in the back is to include a workbook of how to become your own historian of Black girlhood. So thinking about different ways that our research reaches young people. And then I started doing research on Beyonce quite accidentally. She did this thing called Lemonade. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. And it took place in Louisiana, which is, part of my research is on. And so I wrote about a little blog post about it, and then people have been asking me to do Beyonce-related stuff nonstop since then. And in one of my outside letters for tenure review, somebody mentioned that I was a Beyonce scholar. So I guess it's true. Right? I was a little surprised, but it's true. But I will say about Beyonce, the thing that I love about working on Beyonce is that young people get really interested in Black feminism through Beyonce, and so it allows me, I kind of use Beyonce as a tool to teach about Black feminism in ways that maybe Beyonce did not intend, but I like it a lot. So I've been working on Black maternal health. This actually relates to Beyonce, believe it or not. I have an essay coming out in this reader called the Lemonade Reader about infant health, Black maternal loss, and miscarriage. And I do a reading of Lemonade that it's like a text that talks about miscarriage. And Beyonce has talked about miscarriage before. So I talk about that in that article, but it's also part of this larger thing I'm doing on Black maternal health. And I'll just show you really quickly. I don't know if this is working. Okay. But one of those pictures is from the 1940s, and it's from the archives that I came across it in 2011. And it's just a little baby who's being put in an outdoor incubator that has like chicken wire. And I was just obsessed with this image of public health and like what it meant to be a Black baby at this period of time. And that's when I started doing archival research on infant mortality, but also prematurity. And then in 2014, I had my own premature infant, there she is, in her 2014 incubator. And so one of the things in this Lemonade reader that I've been doing and thinking about a lot in this research, and it's really changed the shape of my research, is to be thinking about who am I writing for and to. And instead of writing an academic book on the history of medicine, which is how it started, and the history of public health, I've been thinking about writing a book about healing for Black women who have suffered infertility, miscarriage, infant loss, and other things. And like, kind of what does that look like? I should note here that my daughter's doing well, she's 4. But, yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk real quick about teaching. And I think 2 of my goals in teaching is to encourage students to see themselves as part of a community, a kind of place-based consciousness. And then the other thing is to encourage students to think of themselves as producers of knowledge that can be accessible to the public in different ways. I'm not going to read this quote. It was just to remind me about place-based consciousness. That's Grace Levi's. So this is a class that I teach at the University of Michigan. It's just Black women's history. And I don't know if you can see this at all. Actually, I can't. But I think that's a screen. Yeah, that's a screen that is, in my Black women's history class, one of the things that I've done is, I should preface this by saying that at University of Michigan, and this goes to the place-based stuff, University of Michigan is one of the states that no longer can use race in admissions. And so we have a very, very low amount of Black students. It's, I think, hovering around 3% right now. I think between 3 and 4%. So like University of California, the California system, we're going through some of the same problems that they're going through. And it's had a huge impact on our students of color. Since I've been at the University of Michigan, which is only 3 years, we've had a ton of terrible events happen on campus, which include white supremacist flyering. There was a hoax email that was sent out to all the students that threatened death to Black and Jewish students. It went out to all the engineering students. Somebody peed on prayer rugs in a prayer space. But there's been a lot of different things, like writing the N-word on students' dorm rooms. And so students have been really fatigued. The Black students have been really fatigued. At the same time that they've been engaged in a lot of activism. And so last spring, I taught this class, Black Women's History. I started a rumor on campus that it was going to be full of Black women. And it worked. I got 50 students, 45 of them were Black women. It was the blackest class at the University of Michigan. Maybe not ever, but since the 90s, when there was a lot of Black students. And so it was a really, really cool space. And part of what I wanted this, and I think that goes to the place-based, right, and issues about advocacy. That my goal was to create a space where these students could feel comfortable in a community where they felt under attack. And part of what we did is talk about how we need to create space for Black women on campus and in America when Black women are so marginalized and our very existence is under attack. And it was something that they felt really deeply. I think we lost, but it's okay. I feel like I'm not as loud, but it's okay with me. So one of my goals, we started this project where the students were each researching one Black woman from the past who didn't have a Wikipedia page. And then we had a number of projects. One was this exhibit that you can see here that was in the library, and it was in the undergrad library. So as soon as you walk in, there's all these screens. And they did an exhibit of the different women from their projects, and they gave presentations on them. Another thing that we did is the idea was to make rogue posters, so to do postering of the same exhibits over campus. Thinking about spaces where there's this white supremacist postering versus like Black history postering, and just like what it would mean to see Black women's faces on campus. And then they also wrote Wikipedia pages with varying degrees of success. And this is just a board where they talked about like what it felt like to be in the class and to do this kind of work. One woman said it reminded me that Black women excel in every field, including murder. Sorry, one of the students was obsessed with the first Black woman serial killer. It made me proud to be a Black woman and inspired me to be the best I can be. It showed me just how much Black women and girls are often left out of our societies. So that's just some of the things that we did in that class. It was so powerful even for me because I've never been in a class full of Black women like that myself. And so it even changed how I taught. And this is one of the websites, Wikipedia pages that one of my students did on Gwendolyn Zohara Simmons, who's a well-known civil rights activist, who surprisingly or not, didn't have a Wikipedia page. And this is another of union activist that is not written much about in historical writing, and so it was just cool to see them kind of taking it on themselves to bring voices and histories and stories to what they felt like might be the mainstream. So that was pretty cool. This is actually the same semester, but a different project. It was not related to a class. My students decided to do a exhibit on for Black History Month and Women's History Month on the history of Black women's health, reproductive health. So it's like a reproductive justice exhibit. And they did it in the halls of the library. So it's just another way of just like changing the space of campus. And then this is a different class that I taught, a different semester, where we did kind of the same thing, but we did a Black women's history exhibit at a local, I guess you would call it inner city high school. This was when I was teaching in Buffalo. And those students were so proud of the work that they did, but it was also really cool to get them in the city, engaging with the high school students there. This one student is inside of Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs wrote a slave narrative. She escaped slavery by hiding in the attic for years, and that's the size that it was. So the installation was the same size as the actual attic. But I just remember that one of the high school students walked by and was like, I've never heard of that story. Like, it wasn't true, right? You know, they heard maybe a Frederick Douglass or something. But it was so cool to just like change the space of their high school like that. I think I'll probably be running out of time, but I'll just end by saying one of the other things that I've been working on is called the Institute for Social Change. I was asked if I wanted to do it, and I said yes. So this is my first summer working on it. But it's essentially a 1-week program for graduate students at University of Michigan over the summer. Well, in May. We are also almost done. And so in that, the graduate students talk about and engage with what it means to do work that is public-facing or advocacy work as part of their graduate studies. And so we put together it's kind of like a 1.5 week long discussion, and we bring in outside speakers. So one of the things that we do is we have panels with academics, some academics and some not, who work outside of the academy, so that grad students can also see what our other career paths in this look like. So we bring in people who are activists and advocates. And then we also have the students go on field visits to different sites. This year they're going to one in Detroit. And we host discussions about their research, as well as discussions with faculty, kind of like this, who are on campus, as a way to bring students together across lots of different disciplines, but also let students know who may be working with advisors who don't support public-facing work or activist work, that there's other people at the university who support that. So that's one of the things that I've been working on, trying to get that program ready for May 14th, I believe. So that's some of the work that I've been doing. But I'm happy to talk about, I actually have a lot more too that I didn't put on here that I'd be happy to talk about as well.
Jeremy, do you want to just talk a little bit about your experience with your research, advocacy, and how you try to...
Sure. Yeah. So I guess we're going from like your work with minorities and teaching the blackest class ever, and I feel like I am in the field that is the whitest ever. So I come from the field generally of conservation and natural resources management, which really arose at a time in the progressive era in the turn of the 19th century, in which the majority of the U.S. population was rural, and conservation issues were largely issues of farms and issues of managing wildlife and soils and other things, and what arose, the field that arose from that really was one that had catered to that audience. And so for actually how I got involved in the field is I became very interested in how conservation was changing, and it seemed that the field was changing in terms of its orientation, in terms of what its focus was, in terms of fundamental goals that people saw for conservation. In large part, it arose from ideas about development and how we can efficiently develop resources in rural areas for the good and welfare of people, to a time when we saw tremendous biodiversity loss and loss of species, to the point that people said we have to stop worrying about people a little bit and maybe actually elevate the interests of other organisms. And that became kind of it's still sort of a focal point of debate and controversy within our field. And so, interestingly, in the classroom I teach in the spring right now, I'm just wrapping up, thankfully. I teach a class on wildlife conservation policy and the development history of conservation policy. And I find I spend a lot of time creating a space for students that have really diverse upbringings and diverse ideas about what conservation should be, and trying to create a space that allows them to debate those different purposes, those different goals of conservation. Maybe I can start in talking about advocacy specifically by relaying a story and a bit of an anecdote. I started my PhD program in 2002, and I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey. My advisor was an employee of the U.S. Geological Survey and an adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota. And so the U.S. Geological Survey throughout the country has what are called cooperative fish and wildlife management units. They are a cooperative partnership between a state land grant institution, a state resource management agency, and the U.S. Geological Survey, where the USGS provides the employee, the scientist, the university provides the space with the idea that the instructor will teach or that scientist will teach a class, and the state agency provides some of the funding for research. And so I was a beneficiary of that partnership. I was a student there, and I was studying value change and trying to understand how our values about conservation and nature had changed over time. And within the field, in part because people are extremely sensitive to these ideas about value change, and they have kind of a long history the field has a long history of basically trying not to be advocates. There was a very strong social pressure to just deliver the science, to just deliver the scientific message and let others be advocates. And so that was part of my academic upbringing at the time. I've since come probably 180 degrees. But at the time, I was very much of this philosophy that scientists should not be advocates. Our job was simply to deliver science. And in large part, that was because of strong top-down pressures on the U.S. Geological Survey. So the survey at the time, if you recall, at that time, Jim Hansen had become very publicly engaged in the climate debates. He was a public employee. That made, at the time it was the Bush administration, the second Bush administration was very concerned about that, and so they put in place a policy that said all federal employees now have to do two things. Anything that you submit for a peer-reviewed journal, for even to go to a conference, if you're going to submit an abstract and you want to present at a conference, that will have to be internally peer-reviewed, and there's going to be a Washington bureaucrat that's going to read that and make sure that you're not saying anything that conflicts with what the administration believes. And so that was a very powerful force for me. I said, whoa, that's not right. You know, what's a Washington bureaucrat doing reading our science? They're not equipped to actually critique science. And so that was kind of my first real run-in with advocacy and feeling of, and starting to feel a tension between what my job was and what I thought was right and ethical. The second came actually shortly after my wife and I arrived at Ohio State University. So we came in the fall of 2007, in October of 2007, onto campus. My wife also had done her PhD at the University of Minnesota, and she worked in the area of tobacco policy. At the time, there was a conflict that was going on in the state of Minnesota. There were policies being instituted basically to ban smoking in bars and restaurants. And a lot of the bars and restaurants said, this is going to put us out of business, we can't do this. And so there were a couple of cases where it had been done at the county level. And so she basically did the analysis to look over time to say, I'm going to look at bar receipts and restaurant receipts in these areas with and without these smoking bans to see if it actually is going to hurt these folks. Like, are the restaurants going to be hurt by this? And so the research basically said, no, they could detect no change in the receipts of the bars and restaurants, pre-smoking ban, post-smoking ban, comparing the ban areas to non-areas, there was just no change. And shortly after that paper was published, one of our Ohio legislators contacted Gordon Gee, former president of our university, and told, Gordon wrote a formal letter saying that my wife had sullied the name of Ohio State University with her advocacy. So this was just, she had done nothing other than published a paper in a scientific journal testing a theory that was, about public policy. So that was the kind of second major run-in with advocacy. And since that time, as I said, I've kind of come 180 degrees on the subject, and it has largely to do with, I think, I have a role as a scientist to be objective and dispassionate in the science that we do. But as a citizen, I have a role to be to engage with political issues and do what I think is right. And I don't see those roles as really being at odds whatsoever. And so it took a long time, it took about a decade, but I've really come 180 degrees on that issue. And now I actively engage in advocacy, and I just ensure when I try to do it, I try to be very transparent about what the science says, where my values are intersecting with the science, so I can be clear and articulate what I value, and then let people judge me for that. And I work with groups that are honestly as diverse as on one side the National Rifle Association. I've had to work with groups like that. On the other side, the Humane Society of the United States. Those groups and their values are about as far apart as you could possibly imagine on the political spectrum. And I think I've been able to sort of hit the sweet spot and establish, credibility with those groups, despite having my own strong opinions on issues. So,
Okay, so I'm excited to be here, and I have to say that prior to sitting here, I don't know that I've ever thought of myself as an advocate, but one of the fun things about this is I got to reflect and think about what is advocacy and where have I done it. And as a university professor, it turns out that I think advocacy permeates just about every facet of my job. And so I'm the vice chair for undergraduate education in my department, so I often find myself advocating for students or for other faculty members that teach in our department. In terms of service, I also am a member of the OSU Advocates and Allies group, and our job is basically we are men that recognize the privilege, and we have conversations with other men to try to make OSU more equitable and inclusive campus, really. And so that's some of the advocacy that I've done around campus. I've helped to facilitate some of those discussions, which has really been quite eye-opening. Another hat that we wear is that of teachers. And so actually just today, I found myself thinking about advocacy. So I did study abroad trips, and we have had a student that has come across financial trouble and is having a hard time finding money. And so I found myself going around and sort of shaking various administrative groups at the university to see if anyone has what is probably loose change to them, but what could be sort of life-changing dollar amounts to basically help this student out. And that's a new area for me that feels like it's advocacy for, well, it is advocacy for a student because I really want her to succeed and have this experience. But the person that I co-teach with, we thought about, could we start a GoFundMe, or does that cross a line? Or, so I'm thinking a lot about our role there. But that's for our study abroad trip. Another place where I think about advocacy in terms of study abroad is I think that OSU we do a fantastic job of sending people abroad, and I don't know that we're the most welcoming campus for visitors that come to campus. And so we often find that we go places and there's subsidized housing and fantastic resources and places that we can stay, but yet when visitors come to Ohio State, there's nothing that's affordable. As far as I can tell, there's not a coordinated effort to basically help make these exchanges bidirectional. And so I've been unsuccessful at that, but I find myself having conversations over and over again about how can we be better hosts. And I don't know that we necessarily have these expectations of how we'll be treated when we go abroad, but certainly I feel that we are very one-directional in that, and we need to do better. And then in the context of research, which is why we're here, so my work is focused on HIV and HIV mother-to-child transmission. I don't know that I've done a lot of advocacy directly through work on that, but in my personal life, I'm a board member for a group called Malawi Children's Village, which supports children orphaned by HIV. And it does so not by supporting an orphanage, but by providing community support. And so this is a group that was founded 30 years ago by returned Peace Corps volunteers, of which I'm also one. And so I do a lot of my science-based research on my personal time advocating for Malawi Children's Village and helping to raise money that way. One place in my research where I think we have advocated slightly is, so it turns out HIV can be transmitted through breast milk. And about 5 years ago, a colleague at Nationwide Children's, Sarah Kime, called me up and said, you know that you can go online and you can buy human breast milk online. There's the equivalent of Craigslist. And it turns out that human milk is not regulated, so blood is highly regulated. But you can go online and buy human milk. And there are no FDA regulations about sort of safety or standards of milk that is exchanged online. And so working with Sarah, we went online and bought milk from 110 donors. My job as the virologist was to test it, and ultimately we came up with what I call the 4 Ds. We found that the milk was disgusting, that it was arriving warm and exploded, and it had fecal coliforms. There was only 2 that had some HIV in it. A lot of them had some cytomegalovirus. And so it was unregulated. The second D was dilution. It turns out that people were selling the milk for $5 an ounce, and you can go to Kroger and buy cow's milk cheaper than that. So people were diluting what they were calling human milk with cow's milk because it was a financial transaction. And so we borrowed from environmental science papers where I think people wanted to know basically who was defecating in the river. Was it a goat? Was it a human or a cow? and used the same technology to figure out were there other milks mixed in with the milk. We found that there was no illicit drugs, so that was maybe the only benefit, but we also found that the sellers were deceptive, that they would say that they were caffeine-free or nicotine-free. You can quite easily test for those things. And so while that was science-based, and you know, from what we did, we basically did the same assay 100 times. And so in the lab, it was not all that exciting. But it turns out, I think that we were the first people, and to date, we were the only people that had bought that milk online. And the results of our work have helped to change the policy in both in New Jersey, and then also the FDA has some recommendations that, while not explicitly stated that they're because of our work, they basically marched down all of the publications that we had talking about that. And so I think in that way, sort of my science has sort of advocated for healthier and safer milk exchanges. And I think from that I also learned that probably the best advocate of our research was that we were fortunate that Conan O'Brien picked up our work. And I learned the value of a comedian that could take 3 years of work and turn it into the most perfect 20-second soundbite for that. And so that's an advocacy skill that I'd like to have. So you know, I guess I would just say that sometimes I've been purposeful about advocacy, and other times I've sort of stumbled into it and it's worked out. But inevitably, being an advocate is a very important part of my job.
Thank you. So we have a few questions that are sort of ground clearing questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So the first is, I mean, one thing that I think is great is just sort of all the examples that you're giving from your own work, and it's interesting. This is the first panel where a lot of advocacy or a lot of the sort of ethical issues have been coming up through your teaching, through pedagogy. But in general, so I mean, the one question I have that I would love to hear from each of you, you've touched upon this a little bit, is what came first, your research interests or your political and social commitments that motivate your advocacy? And maybe it's not a what came first, what came next. So that's one question. The other question is, how has being a researcher changed your sort of perspective on what you advocate for and how you think about your role as an advocate?
So I'll start. So with the breast milk example, I will say that the research came first on that. And you know, while we never wrote any position papers or directly advocated, that story got a lot of press. And so my colleague was in the New York Times and all over the place doing interviews. I got to do some interviews as well. And so I think we got to do some advocacy on behalf of our position, which was that this was an unsafe practice. And so we got to do that. In terms of my research on HIV, I guess I would say that probably when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, that probably made an advocate out of me. I didn't realize that until at least 10 years after I had returned, and it seemed to present itself as an opportunity where I could bridge personal interest and my research. And as a dual career, 2-kid person, like time is limited, so whenever I can get two things that overlap, it seemed like it was a win. It's something that I was gladly would advocate for. So I would say I had both directions.
I guess the research came first in some ways, but I also was pretty young when I started grad school, so I don't know. I wasn't thinking big when I started. I was just trying to do a dissertation. But I think it was probably always there, and I think one of the things that I've been trying to do in the meantime, probably ever since I finished my dissertation, is be a community member of the place that I'm at. And it's hard because in our careers we move around so much, and a lot of us aren't teaching at the place that we grew up. And I wanted to feel like rooted, and so some of the ways that I did that was to start getting involved in community. And for my research, I was able to do that when I was in New Orleans, but once I had left that, I was like in a new, unfamiliar place. And so for me, it was really important, firstly, to like branch off just from, the university campus. I was at SUNY Buffalo and the campuses in the suburbs. And just like being a member of Buffalo, a community member, was important to me. And then the next step was really trying to get my students to do the same thing, where it's like, even though you're only here maybe for 4 years, can you also be a member of the place that you're in? Whether that's the university community one, but then like also the local community outside of the university. And so those are things that I've been really interested in doing since I graduated from my PhD program, and then just trying to be a citizen of the place that I live in.
Yeah, so I guess I would say, and differentiate a little bit and say that the interests kind of came first. And so I grew up in a rural area, and then my undergraduate degree is in art, so I did a mid-career change, and I actually spent a lot of time studying artists of the progressive era, especially those that were painting nature and so your Frederick Edwin Churches and Thomas Coles and those sorts of folks. And that was a huge point of interest for me. And then my wife and I moved from Michigan, where we did our undergraduate work, out to the San Francisco Bay Area. And that was a kind of a huge step forward. I got to see all the land in between. We drove across the country, and that was a wonderful experience. And I think that really kind of set me on the path to advocacy, at least for conservation issues and public lands issues. But for a very long time, I refused to get involved because I was a scientist, and I was worried about how involvement in those issues would actually be perceived by my peers and by the folks in agencies that I work with. So we work a lot with agencies in the federal government. It's not just the U.S. Geological Survey. It's these state agencies, it's the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service. So all of these different groups, and there's, as I said, there's sort of a strong normative pressure to be seen as an advocate. So that's changed over time, and I've kind of learned to be a better advocate and be an honest advocate, and I think that's kind of appreciated.
Do you think, this is a follow-up on that, do you think that it really relates to this ACES question, do you think the university is a welcoming institution for advocacy for its faculty, for its graduate students?
Makes me think about the March for Science recently. Because I feel like a lot of people who were involved in that didn't see themselves as political.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you learn being at a university is you learn a sort of tolerance for different types of people and different perspectives, and so that creates a sort of desire for advocacy on its own, right? I have to be able to function in a space where people are very different from me. Especially, I'm in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Science, and ag and natural resources come into conflict all the time. So I've got people in my own college that value things very differently than say I do, and I work with those people in those spaces. So I think there is something valuable about working around people with different sets of values and with different ideas, and being exposed to those different ideas, and being open to learn that the university setting provides.
I guess I would just add that I feel that the university has been somewhat neutral. I haven't been approached or never asked, but I don't know that I work on that edgy, at the edge of where they would, but I feel that universities are fantastic places to do research. Maybe we'll come to this later. One thing that I do wonder about is we have fantastic students, and I often wonder about creating space for students to be advocates, and in particular about, there's some state legislation about sex education that is quite anachronistic. And I've often thought about it, if it would be possible to make a space for students to try to be involved in that. And, I've been hesitant, but mostly out of ignorance, because I just don't know, if that would cross the lines or not.
So, was there a time in your academic career in which you worried about taking on the role of advocate? I know Jeremy talked about this a little bit and has had a change of face, but have you ever confronted challenges that your advocacy actually undermines the integrity of your research? So not like the challenges from outside, but actually thinking that, you know, if I take on this role of advocate, it could actually make my research have either less integrity, less objectivity, whatever it is that, whatever metrics that happen.
So my research, I mean, a lot of what I deal with is studying how people make judgments and decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that you can be biased by making particular statements, right? And so if I come out with a strong statement from an advocacy standpoint, and then science later tells me something that conflicts with that, that's going to create a tension, right? And so I think one of the ways that you learn to deal with that is to be very precise in the types of statements that you make. And you have to be open to putting your foot in the mouth. Some of the research that I did early on actually conflicted with research we did later. The research we did later was better, and so I had to turn, and say, yep, what we said before, it turns out that's not correct. What we're saying now, that's what we believe is correct.
So that's precision when it comes to how you report your research to the public, right?
Yeah, and an openness to actually, to say, hey, we've made a mistake, or, I advocated based upon what I understood. What I've understood has actually changed. I mean, that's, I think, just being a responsible citizen, trying to accurately incorporate what science tells us about what is with how we value and what ethics tells us about what should be, right?
I don't worry so much about objectivity. I don't care if I'm objective. But I have had to make decisions about like the time that you put into some of these projects and how much time it can take away from your research agenda, which can, hurt your career. So I've had to make those kinds of decisions. And then the other thing I've been thinking about recently too is what you can whose stories can you responsibly tell in your research? So those are the kinds of decisions that I try to think about. So in the miscarriage infant loss article that I mentioned, I talk a lot about, I mentioned the story of one of my friends. And so, trying to figure out, like, is it okay to tell this story? She had just lost her son. And, even asking her if it's okay, is it okay, it could be traumatizing just to have someone ask if it's okay to tell your story. And then maybe she would change her mind later on, so just trying to like navigate that kind of relationship. And the same, I tell the story of some women who tell the story of their losses on YouTube by posting Beyonce telling the story of her loss. She wrote a little miscarriage song, and then they post it, and then they tell the story of their own miscarriage. And so then the ethics of like writing about that, do you use their names? Because then if they search for it on Google, like it will come up in this miscarriage book, would that be okay? And so trying to make those different kinds of decisions. In the end, I didn't use their names, but in one case I used the name of their son, because then I felt like, if they Google their son's name and like that they lived for an hour will be marked somewhere. So, but trying to like make those distinctions is really, that part is hard.
I guess I feel like I'm an advocate light, and so that I'm not out at the forefront of these things. But when doing the breast milk research, we had to be very cautious about where we solicited funding from, and our partners were. We wanted to partner with some milk banks, but we wanted to not be seen as sort of perfectly in step with them. There are some companies that are that actually collect milk and sterilize it and package it. And they had asked about working together, and so we had to make some decisions about who our partners would be, for fear of sort of, I guess, the appearance of a conflict of interest that could rightfully or wrongfully damage our credibility of what we were doing. So it turns out that breast milk sharing in feeding practices is a lot of energy around. So we tried hard to not get caught in the crossfire.
Well, maybe
It's an understatement.
Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe now is a good time for people to ask questions. Yeah.
We're going to talk about two associated different things at the same time. And one I sort of characterize as outreach, getting our message out to the public, which is, I think, really important. If we ever get to administration that's fact-based again, having a public who cares about facts, recognizes them, and knows how to make those decisions can be crucially important. And the other I would call more advocacy. We try to affect change. And I think faculty numbers are in a perfect position to do that. I do this through an organization called INDI, the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering, which is kind of an elected group of about 1,000, 1,500 engineers in medical and biological areas. And we advocate not for our own research, but for basically science funding in general. So we go and talk to Congress a couple times a year. And faculty are perfect to do that since Congress is won by congressional aides who are about the age of our graduates. Because the range of issues that a Congressperson has to do is impossible. So they've got advocates in different areas that they care about, or aides in different areas. And those folks really frame your argument. So being able to talk to them, and what we found over time is that graphs and charts and data don't work as well as they do. And you could probably present tons of data about HIV incidence and transmission. And that's just facts. Your story about breast milk, and this is believed, and this is affecting innocent kids who don't know, parents don't know their risk because of what they're doing. That resonates with folks, and that's something that is going to get somebody's attention. So I think that faculty can do that, should be able to do that really well. It's a group we're supposed to know how to talk to. And I think that if we go in advocating for policy and not for ourselves, I'd love to go to Congress and say, fund my research, it's great, come on. That's not getting me anywhere. But advocating in general for larger NIH budgets or larger NSF budgets by saying that, last year NIH approved 41,000 grants including funding. Or that the buying power of NIH is 20% more than the decade. So it's a broader thing. You're not going in there saying, help me. We're helping society. I think that kind of advocacy is harder to do. It's a long-term investment. You don't get a 10-minute visit with Congress and somebody saying, yeah, we'll do that. But I think that that's sort of separate from the outreach that we also need to do and get our stuff out there. And the scientists, I think, we're really reluctant to do that. So we out there and just try to both either advocate or reach ourselves. It takes some special experience and guts to do that kind of stuff.
I mean, this is related to, so one question is about, that kind of came out of Jeremy's point, is, when so one thing you could be advocating for is just research, right? And research funding, and it's like, in some ways, it's not, priority for research is not that controversial, especially if you're, coming from a researcher perspective, right? But then when you start thinking about advocacy on behalf of, non-human organisms or like changes in priority setting, have you ever experienced any sort of, this is to the panelists, but also out to the group, have you ever experienced any sort of pushback on the sorts of things that you're trying to prioritize as something that is important? Because it's related to research, because it's the sort of thing that you are actually like in a very special place to advocate for, but then there's pushback about other issues that are also really important, and whether or not we should be spending so much money on some sort of research that would be really great for us in terms of our research, but isn't necessarily like the best use of public funds.
We've seen a lot of pushback, people saying, yeah, that's a great idea, but my priority is balancing the budget.
Right.
And therefore, whatever you want, no matter how great it is, I'm not going to do it. And some folks are honest enough to say that. And some literally, gas you to death out of the office. But it's kind of like submitting grants, 100% of the ones that aren't submitted are funded. So if you're not there pushing for whatever cause you want to push for, it's not going to happen. The same way that, legislatures look at who's called about what issues, they also look at who hasn't called. My constituents don't care if no one's called. So I think that's the reason that we're there, fighting over that all the time.
I'll just mention one. In our experience, so I'm involved in the Center for Ethics and Human Values that helps organize this event. But one of our other programs is called Compass, which is called Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And one of the things we've encountered there a lot is it's basically a program, a year-long set of events that is meant to model something like good deliberative democracy on some issue of national significance. And one of the, so immigration or inequality, sustainability, we've done, and people have strong views on these issues and they disagree with each other. And one of the things that we have always felt a tension with is to what extent in having this kind of a program do we have an opportunity to advocate for a certain view of what the right view is on some of these issues? And to what extent do we have to remain sort of committed to some kind of more procedural goals, say, just sort of what the nature of good deliberation is? And at least in that program, we've come very much down on the side of saying, well, we believe in facts, okay? And so we feel like we have to trust our judgment on some kind of basics there. But in general, we've come down on the side of saying, we are trying to create opportunities for people to learn and develop informed judgments on these issues, but as much as we can avoid it, the sort of kind of advocacy for a particular view on what these issues should be. And I think that has actually turned off some of our colleagues who are doing research in a way that they have a clear view on this. They think there's some clear wrong. And the idea that sort of this is the way we're running our program means that they're a little bit less interested in being involved in the program, although we might be happy to have them as a speaker on a panel, say where they're arguing with other people. But in terms of just sort of being part of the organization of the program itself, we have a slightly different agenda. And I'll just sort of put that out there as another example of sort of this tension between, it's not exactly research and advocacy, but just sort of trying to maintain some commitment to say, we're just about sort of having a certain kind of informed conversation related to research versus saying we're actually trying to see if we can be changing people's minds.
I can speak directly. I mean, in the sustainability and conservation realm, what you're talking about, conservation arose at a time when we were doing a lot of really bad things to the environment, right? And so we had examples of soil loss, we had examples of multiple extinctions, localized and actual full-on extinctions. We had these whole forests cut down, right? So we had these examples of where we had unsustainably used this resource, and the response was, we need a system to do this sustainably. Well, we've pushed it now to a point where, in many cases, in the sector that I work in most, in wildlife, we have populations like white-tailed deer that are now overabundant in places. So the conservation movement arose out of this need to prevent these species from going extinct. And now they've got to the point where they're overabundant, or they're perceived that way. And we have to make choices from a perspective of sustainability. And in these conservation contexts, it comes up again and again. I can emphasize equitable distribution of resources, right? Environmental justice for people now. I might think about future generations, right? And then I might make a different decision if I'm thinking about having these resources present for the future. I might emphasize the biodiversity perspective and say there are other organisms here that have intrinsic value, or the populations have intrinsic value and may need to be considered for themselves. I'm going to make a different type of judgment in that context. And so we play in this world where you're trading off values against one another quite often. And I would agree with you. It's a very it's a tricky place to play, and it's an even trickier place to be an advocate. Most often, I'm advocating for looking at those broader set of views, in large part because we've had conservation has been dominated by a few voices. So the power dynamics within that arena of policy favor certain types of people. And so we're arguing for that, exactly what you're talking about, which is a more democratic form of governance. No.
Can you hear me through the mic? Okay. So great. So it's not actually a follow-up to that. I have a different question that I want to put to the panel. So we've been talking a bunch about the risks associated with advocacy as researchers, and I want to turn that a little bit and hear your thoughts on the risks associated with not advocating, and maybe push you a little bit to ask whether you have an obligation to be an advocate. The Academy is an incredibly safe space, right? You're 3 tenured professors. You can't be fired for your advocacy work. You could be scolded by your university, but you really are in a protected position to do some of this work that lots of other people in lots of other places are not. And I saw this a little bit. I teach a medical school class that touches on many areas of advocacy. And somebody from Jeremy's college actually came and spoke about environmental justice and shared some data that she had locally that were about putting sort of like factories and high pollution emitters in communities of color, and sort of what the health impacts were. And she presented her work, which was very compelling, and then the students asked her a bunch of questions about who she was telling and what was her, what kind of, where was the news coverage, and she said, well, I'm not going to put this out until I'm tenured, because it's very dangerous for me to, professionally, I'm at risk of facing consequences for this. And the students were outraged, and they just couldn't believe that this would be a consideration for her. And I, as also a junior faculty member, thought, like, that seems really smart. She's really thought this through. But there was such a disconnect in that space. So anyway, I'm just curious what you all think about that.
I mean, I guess I would say it's complicated in the sense that since I've been tenured, I think there's lots of things that I'm very interested in doing. Being able to go out and garner the funds to do a lot of those things often sets my agenda as a biomedical researcher. So I agree with you in that there are consequences for not doing more, and yet we're dependent upon finding funding to support those projects. So the breast milk project that we did, we had a lot of, I think, pertinent follow-up questions. So how do we turn that finding into something actionable? And so our take-home message was that women are sharing milk because there's just not enough milk out there, not safe milk out there. And so we really would like to find a way to run some campaigns to make people more aware of sort of regulated milk banks that already exist. And we've had a really hard time finding money to advocate for that. So I think we probably should be riskier. And to go back to the comment about outreach as well, I think we need to be talking about the value of basic research a lot more as well. And so maybe 4 years ago, Pat Teaberry came to campus and talked about biomedical research, and he was very interested in cherry picking what he thought were good projects and bad projects. And he's like, what? I honestly think his example was, do we really need another teen drinking study? And I was like, you're at a college campus and that's what you're talking about? But anyway, I think that was the example he gave, and so I think a challenge of doing research is we often don't know what's going to translate into a finding that has a traditional return on investment, right? So I like to think about CRISPR, and so if you've ever heard of CRISPR, it's a gene editing technology. that actually is a bacterial immune defense against viruses that people were sort of working on for a long time in the realm of bacterial immunology, which I think most people don't really care about. But now it's turned into something that's opened up a whole new set of questions, ethical questions that we have to think about that way. And so I guess what I would say is, I think we probably could do more, but we also have to do some more basic science because we don't know what's going to turn into the next policy changing or the next sort of field changing discovery, which is not quite the question you had, but
Yeah, I guess I'm
probably
speaking
do more.
specifically about the area of controversial advocacy, right? So I think to your earlier point and to yours about advocating for basic science, those are not hard things to advocate for, and I'm not sure I call them advocacy and of the risky sort, right? So I more mean things. You have a microphone and a space to say things that other people also think but can't say, and should you be using it?
I guess I would start by maybe separating the roles that we have. So we play a role as scientists, and that might come with certain obligations. And we might actually think about those obligations differently among different disciplines. But I think our obligations as citizens would trump the role of scientists. So scientist is my job, but citizen is something that is more near to my heart, I guess, right? And that's something that's maybe more important. And so I would start with it as do I as a citizen feel strongly enough about issue X that I'm willing to take a risk? And do I feel like I need to speak up and say something? And I think you could do this with this, I suppose, a series of like, you could kind of picture some vignettes and think about some scenarios in which this would come up, where somebody would have to, they might have knowledge by virtue of being a scientist about a particular issue, and then that could have impacts on populations of color or whatever. And do they feel like that those impacts are sufficient to justify them having to speak up, even if it's politically inconvenient to do so? I would say by virtue of being a citizen, that supersedes. If you feel strongly about something, if you feel it's the right thing to do, then you're obligated to speak up.
I think the timing issue is real too. I can't go speak for the university. I speak for myself. University and I don't agree on it. But also, as you mentioned, before your tenure, there's an increased risk. And like any other advocacy issue, how much you're willing to put yourself out there and take that risk is going to change, depending on the risk changes. And your willingness to be out there and do that changes. So I would underestimate it's hard enough to get established.
So there is a risk too, as even tenured people. So there's a colleague in my field who spoke up about a particular issue a few years ago that conflicted pretty strongly with the agricultural industry in the state. This is out in Washington State, and there were basically, it turned out there was an investigation, and there were back channel politicians saying, if you can't shut this guy up, you guys aren't going to get funding for this new building in the library or something. And they went after his funding. So he's tenured. They couldn't take tenure away. They couldn't fire him, but they took his funding away, essentially gave it to somebody else, and he was isolated. So there, even as tenured professors, there are risks to taking controversial positions.
That's actually a good. Is this on? Okay, right. That's actually a good segue to what I was going to ask. And one thing I was struck by all three of your stories, your presentations, was like the possibilities and the limits of your work. You started with you had this great class of 45 out of 50 Black women, but it was the first, and you had to do some like engineering to do that, and you prefaced the presentation with the change in U of M's admissions policies, and you talked about having to navigate, the Humane Society and the NRA. You just told the story about this outside funding, and then when you were talking about the breast milk, I was thinking, on one hand, it's good to have safe breast milk, but I also was thinking the people who are submitting that breast milk likely possibly need the money. And so I was wondering if you could each reflect on, like, I'll let you define the issue as you see fit, but what are the biggest constraints on an issue that you care about? Yeah, is that like an institutional, an economic, or personal constraint of some kind?
I think for me, one of the things we haven't really talked about much is just labor, our labor, and how much time this stuff takes, which is a lot. And I get really tired, and if I had more time, I could do more. Well, and more resources. I had some postdoc. So I have a lot of research projects that I'm doing right now. Like there's one on Black women, the history of Black women at U of M. And the students have done tons of research, but a lot of the products that we want to come out of that, like we have a walking tour, a history walking tour that we finished. But like I want to have a card exhibit on campus and all these other things, but I can't do everything. And I have my own research that's like my actual research that I'm doing as well. And so, you know, it's hard, like you can't do everything. And that's like resources, time, and actual, you know, labor. And a lot of the labor, I feel like I have, a lot of the labor is invisible labor in our field. So there's also that.
I agree.
I've heard that.
Yeah, resources and time, absolutely. Like those really constrain what you can do and accomplish. I mean, there are other things, right? In some of what we talked about, like feeling potential, like there's a potential for political backlash or something. I certainly felt that when I was more junior and was more nervous about it. Although I would say I've always felt supported by the institution and by my school and administration there, but it was definitely more fearful of it at that time.
I think there's definitely, you know, at U of M right now, U of M has, I can't really say. I was going to say historically it's been very supportive, but there's some cases where not. But there's definitely, we're having issues around letters of recommendation right now, and you may have heard in the news, but this one professor who was just entering his tenure decided not to write a letter of recommendation for a student who wanted to study at an Israeli institution. And so there was a huge backlash. And U of M, for as rich as it is, cares so much about money and funders. And so if you piss off the funders and the donors, then you could be in trouble. So it depends on the issue. And Melissa Alexander just wrote that editorial on MLK Day about the issue of Palestine and said this is an ethical issue and we're afraid to talk about it, but we should talk about it. And just in the context of my university, it's something that I would never feel comfortable like denying a student a letter of recommendation because I don't feel. And they just came out with new recommendations for us, which said literally, I mean this was today or yesterday, that literally said that we have to make these judgments based only on academic and professional considerations, whatever that means, because I'm not exactly sure what professional means. So, and then it says, no matter how moral you feel as a kind of conscientious objector, for letters of recommendation writ large. So, I mean, personally, I would never make the decision not to write a letter of recommendation for a student, but let's say one of my students was a white supremacist, which we, you know, all these things that are going on campus. Am I obligated to write a letter of recommendation for them? Or is that a professional exemption? Because I don't think they're professionally able to do whatever it is. Like, I don't even know, right? And so then it's just like, or for a white supremacist organization, maybe they would have my back in that situation, but, you know, so I think it depends on what you're advocating for. For some people like me, advocating for Black women and girls sometimes might not be popular. Sometimes it is popular. But for the most part, people just leave me alone. You know? The administration doesn't care one way or the other, except for when they want to tout diversity, in which case it's really, really easy. But other than that, if they don't need a picture, they don't care what I'm doing. But if I was advocating for something else, right, it would be different. Even in a space where like people are peeing on prayer rugs at our university, but you know, when this one professor, and there's a grad student who did this too, those two people got punished because of what they were advocating for. So I think it's you know, some things it's very safe to advocate for Black women and girls in terms of my job security, but it's not true for all of our topics.
I want to take this back to fundamental issues of our integrity as researchers and scientists. Because once you become an advocate, you've made a decision that a particular position is a good position. And I wonder if that then changes the kinds of research questions you ask and the kinds of data that you even collect. I mean, it sort of seems like there's the potential for blowback there. That once you've made this decision that a particular position is a good position, that's going to color your future thoughts about your research field. And I wonder if any of you have ever grappled with that.
I think I said I don't care about objectivity, but it's because I trained as a feminist. And so like, you know, maybe someone like Ann Foster Sterling, her feminist leanings have completely colored her research questions. But it's led to what I think is like some of the most exciting stuff. So I think that one of my friends who's well, she's in something like astrophysics. I don't know what she does. But one of the, she has a paper coming out in Science. And I read it for her, so that's why I know what's in it. But one of the things she argues is that in astrophysics, the questions that have been asked in astrophysics have been limited by the fact that it's all white men who are allowed to be in the conversation. And that a diversity of backgrounds and a diversity of opinions, a diversity of political opinions, changes the field of study for the better. And she was saying that they're stuck on some question. I don't know what question they're stuck on. I did read this in the fall, by the way. Not that I totally understood that. They're stuck on a certain question. And she was saying part of the reason we're stuck on that question is because we don't have enough people at the table thinking about the right ways to ask the question and do the research and collect the data. And so if we think that only one set of objective ways of seeing a question is okay, it's going to limit the field of research and the field of questions in a way that I think is negative. And opening it up to a wider viewpoint in a period of time when we think DNA is destiny, and we're being guided by that both like in this current moment, scientifically. I don't want to speak too much about science, but also publicly, right? In the public imagination, we think that DNA is destiny. We even think it's history. Like we can go to Ancestry and test it and learn about our history. And we think, we meaning non-scientists, think that that is a like scientific fact when we know that it's not, right? And so part of what I think like somebody like Ann Foster Sterling brings to the conversation is like, but our bodies change with culture. Right at a moment where everybody is like DNA this and that. That's really interesting to me. She might end up being wrong. But to have that conversation at a moment when everything is pushing in a different direction is to me really important. Because otherwise we get blinders and what we think is objective is really just popular. That's what I think. But I'm not a scientist, again, so.
I think you can address that question really easily from using a quick thought experiment. And so the thought experiment would go something like this. It would be, let's say some legislators, and we'll pick another state, we won't pick out Ohio. Let's say some legislators in the state of Nevada decide that they could make a lot of money were they to legalize child prostitution. And we as university researchers spoke out against that as we thought we should be. Would people judge us because of that advocacy, and would they judge the questions that we chose to ask because of that advocacy? And I think if they did, we would say, well, that's your problem. If you're judging me because of my prior advocacy, if you can't assume that I can stay objective on issues and still feel passionately about particular subjects, that's your problem. That's not my problem. My problem is to be as an objective researcher as I can, and knowing, as a social scientist, knowing that that taking a position at some point might actually compromise that, I can actually take action that allows me to, the best action to attempt to reduce bias is to be aware of that bias. And knowing going in that there's a potential bias that could result from your action, then you play the little thought experiment through and you say, okay, well, what's going to happen if science comes out that conflicts with this position? I'm going to have to eat my words, I'm going to eat some crow. And if you're okay with that, then, great. And if you're not okay with eating crow, then maybe you should stay silent. I don't know. But I think that one of the problems that comes up with policy issues is no one thinks to ask that question that you just asked. If we all agree on something, like child prostitution and the fact that it's wrong, if we agree on that universally, no one would ever speak up and say, you shouldn't be an advocate. It's only when we disagree as a society that people step up and say, how dare you, scientists? How dare you be an advocate? And so I think we should be pushing back on that and saying, hey, I have an obligation here too. That's...
I guess I would just add, we can't be everything to everybody. And the only way to define boundaries and figure out is to push. And as Jeremy just said, at some point, your hypothesis might be disproven. You might have to step back. But if you haven't pushed in the first place, then we might never, you might never know that. And so I think, as long as even if you're moving in a direction, as long as you're proceeding in that direction as objectively as you can, I think that is our job to go the way that the science that we have at that moment in time is taking us. Again, science changes as we learn more.
So before Dawn, I just want to flag one thing that I think is really interesting, right? That is a methodological question about the value of objectivity in your research, right? Because it seems like, from what I'm hearing, that it's from some perspectives, it's really research integrity and objectivity, or at least the perception of objectivity from the outside or from the public is super important. And I hear what I hear from LaKisha at least is actually it's really important to ask interesting questions and open up the field and sort of expand, sort of project expanding and project opening questions, right? And sometimes when we worry so much about objectivity, given the lack of diversity in some fields, we end up only worrying about the questions that there's consensus that those are the appropriate questions to ask. That's not the objectivity, that's just the questions we've all agreed aren't controversial, right? Is that sort of, so I think that's just, I just want to flag that as a potential question about sort of whether research integrity really requires us to aspire to objectivity, or whether objectivity really is something that masks or elides some other biases that are already going on in our research disciplines, given the lack of diversity of other people that are asking questions.
It makes me think a lot about Dorothy Roberts, she has a book on DNA science now, and before that was about Black women and health. But she's been on Twitter a lot, arguing with doctors, not purposefully, but she just randomly tweets one-liners, which is always dangerous. I try never to do that. And then doctors or med students especially tweet her back, and for me it's frustrating because I'm if they would just read her book, they're just reading a one-liner tweet. But one of the things that makes me think about is about how objectivity itself is raced. She's a critical race theorist. She works in law school at Penn. And for her, the idea, she's thinking about DNA as a new form of racial science. And some of these doctors who do certain kinds of training, she mentioned something, I can't remember what the procedure was, but it's a test and it has 2 different normal levels. Did you see this? Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't know.
Filtration rate?
Yes, thank you. Yes, and if you're African American, you have to multiply it by 1 point something, and then if you get that, you're healthy. But if you're white, you're not healthy. Right? Okay, so the med students were tweeting back to her, no, but this is really important because African Americans have a different BMI and all this kind of stuff. And the idea that that's objective is silly when you really start thinking about it. Like, I'm half white and half black. So what do you use for me? Right? Once you start really thinking about it, and then me, I actually did test my DNA.
In between the two, right?
Exactly. And I did actually test my DNA, which I said I'd go, I sent it into Ancestry and everything. So supposedly I'm 50% black, which is super black for somebody who's half white. I have a white parent, okay? Because most African Americans. So then when you start breaking it down, well, most African Americans are like pretty white. So what does that mean in terms of this test? And a lot of the African Americans who have 2 African American parents are a lot whiter than me. What does that mean in terms of this test? Like, once you really start thinking about it, it makes no sense. But from an objective, like, medical standpoint, it has made sense for years. It's made racial sense. And so that's kind of her point. And so I think that sometimes, like, we think that objectivity is, like, something that makes sense. It makes ideological sense. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's been objective.
So, we sort of touched on issues that related to what I want to ask about, but let me introduce it this way. Between 2015 and 2018, according to Gallup, the public confidence in higher education has dropped significantly. That dropped more than in any other department.
Stop.
Okay. It's dropped more than any other institution. Most institutions have seen declining public confidence. Now we know what some of the reasons are, and in part you can infer the reasons from the difference in the demographics of the drop in public confidence in higher education. It's been very significant among Republicans, which are probably disproportionately viewers of Fox News, and it's been less significant among Democrats and Independents, though there has been a drop in public confidence in higher education. Now, some of this is because of a perception that the research that universities are doing and the teaching that we're doing has a particular science to it. And some of it's fed by corporate interests to try to silence, and we had an example of that a moment ago, I think, because Jeremy gave the example of that. No one wants researchers to quit talking about the dangers of Roundup or the dangers of buying breast milk over the internet or issues of social justice and so forth. But I'm wondering if any of the 3 of you have thought about what we do to address the concerns that some people have about the research and the teaching that's done in higher education, the concern they have that it's advocacy and it's advocacy in one particular direction. I think, Jeremy, you said something like, if you think that I'm biased, maybe it's your problem, not mine, but it becomes our problem if the public thinks that we're biased and we lose support for higher education and for research because of that. And LaKisha, you said something about the diversity of opinion and so forth, and that's, I think that's extremely valuable, but one of the criticisms that we get from people on the right all the time is that we're not a very diverse institution, especially in my college, humanities or the social sciences, and we're not particularly diverse there ideologically. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about, given the moral imperative to be an advocate on some of these issues, but there's also a requirement that we ensure that the public have confidence in what we're doing. How do we do that? How do we balance this?
I think for me, part of it is, I think a couple things. One, I think that higher education isn't all that accessible to everybody. And that's a problem. And one of the, maybe not the reason why people have attacked higher education recently, I think you're pointing to some of the other reasons that are a lot, more compelling. But it is one of the reasons, and I think the cost of higher education right now and the kinds of loans our students are taking out and stuff like that, it makes people not want to trust higher education because it becomes elitist in a way, and it's not that useful, to go to college and then leave with $100,000 in debt. So I think that's one reason why some people might be skeptical about the value of college, which is slightly separate than what you're saying, but it's something that we should be concerned about for the health of our institutions, but also for our students. But on the other hand, I can't engage with people who think I'm worthless or what I do is worthless, because I have other areas of advocacy. But one of the things I do with my students that I think is super important is that there's this perception that professors are not very diverse, but we actually are all quite different from one another in what we believe, what we value, how we talk about our beliefs and values, whether or not we value objectivity in the ways that we, all these things. We have very different political positions here in this room. But from a point of cartoonish Fox News, we might all look the exact same. And so when I'm teaching my students, one of the things I want them to see is those differences. And that we should be critical thinkers, right? In all different kinds of ways. And our society is becoming very polarized, but it's not just that. I feel we've lost the ability to read. So my leftist friends, when they see something on some clickbait, they go crazy over it. And it's no context, no nothing. It's just so-and-so did this one time. You have no idea. It's totally pulled out of thin air. And when you actually put context in it, there's no reason for them to be so angry, in my opinion. And so I feel that's happening on both the left and the right. And so there's a lot of ways in which we can engage in that debate, in ways that I think are maybe objective, bring a little bit of objectivity to some of the stuff that's going on. So for me, that's more important than trying to. But I agree that if the public doesn't have confidence in us, that in the end it will, especially those of us who teach at public institutions.
I'm not an ethicist, so I'm doing this with some great risk, but adopting some ethical jargon and if I could maybe frame that question, and I don't want to frame your argument the wrong way, but when it seems like on one perspective I was adopting sort of a virtue theorist perspective, right? So I'm basically saying I have an obligation to act virtuously, to engage honestly, to treat people in a particular way. And your response was, well then, what happens if that comes at a cost to society? And so you're adopting kind of a different theory, right? Because now we're talking about the consequences, and so we're sort of adopting consequentialism, and those two things may be at odds. And I would say, you all are ethicists, so you should tell us, as scientists, what we should do, because that's not
If you ask him, they'll say virtue. If you ask me, I'll say consequences.
I guess I would just say that, so in my class that I co-teach with a historian called The History of HIV, we try to tackle complicated issues head on. So we talk about the drug development or the development of anti-HIV drugs. We've often brought in executives from the pharmaceutical industry to provide some context for how those drugs are developed, and we'd like to have the students at least try to think about the issues from different sides, and so we really try to bring in the different positions. And and make the students think and sort of arrive at their own position. So I feel like locally, you can just try to at least present some of the arguments and the thoughts around complicated issues. At a higher level, I kind of feel like that's university government relations, and I hope that the university is working hard with state government to do those things. I think one of the things that I think about here at Ohio State is, since I got here, and these numbers are probably wrong, but I got here in 2007, and I feel like the state was 17% of the budget, and now it's 7%. And so we have a board of trustees that has few, if any, academics on it that are all appointed by state government, and they're a minority part of our budget, and yet they control the university. And so I think about that a lot. I realize that all of our assets and things are a bigger part of the budget, but we are governed by mostly business appointees.
So I'm sharing, sorry if you guys can't see this. This is a flyer from 1887 that I found in the hallways of Common Hall. And it's an advertisement for Ohio State University. It says, degrees are conferred in arts, philosophy, science, agriculture, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, mining engineering, veterinary medicine, and pharmacy. And down here in the bottom, you guys can see it says tuition is free.
Well, there's some people who argue that we need to be out in the public more because it will make the public trust us more.
And this will be the last question.
Oh, it better not be. You guys have been great. I'm trying to figure out just whether we're making a distinction between questions, whether we can we be objective about facts, or can we be objective about the questions we ask about facts? And I hear when Jesse talks about your research on breast milk, I am trusting the objectivity of the facts you determine in your assays of the milk. And when was it LaKisha? When you said, I can't be objective, or I have to be an advocate, it seemed to me that you were taking a position that you cannot be, or one cannot be, because of implicit bias or one's position in society, objective on the questions we ask about the facts, and need to acknowledge that. Is this distinction useful or applicable?
Yeah, I was thinking something similar. Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that you are objective or you're not. There's probably a continuum there of objectivity. And it's maybe something that we aspire to rather than something that is or isn't. And we aspire to it, I think what you're saying is in certain contexts, if we want to be objective. And so when I'm running a particular test, a medical test, or in my case, I'm running psychological tests, I want to be objective about what those results are. But when I go to interpret those, this is where the meaning, I bring in all that meaning from culture comes in, right? And that's where maybe the objectivity is threatened, and it's much harder. Even the culture of a research paradigm that you're working under, right? I mean, that's an influence of the prior studies and all of the researchers that have gone before you in that area that are telling you, what is. And so I think I'm agreeing in that it is a useful distinction, but I think we should think about objectivity as sort of an aspirational goal that is maybe more or less possible in different contexts.
I mean, thinking about the assays, Dr. Norris Turner over there, she and I are working on a project about a bacterial outbreak, and what seems like it should be a yes/no answer. We ended up having 2-hour lab meetings about, what does this actually mean? And so often in the literature it's presented as yes/no, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty, and you're actually looking at it, it turns out there's subjectivity all the way through the objectivity. And so you hope that you have enough controls and framework and external validation that it can be objective, but sometimes even what should be the simplest assay is really not always objective.
towards objectivity, I think. But one thing I would also say, and I like the idea that there's subjectivity all through the process. One thing I might say too, though, is that even the facts themselves, something that might seem like a fact at one moment, historically, but then like 100 years, was clearly not a fact, right? Like measuring craniums or something. So like, even the facts change, which I can say easily because I'm a historian, and so it's also easier to see and safer for me.
I mean, so one thing is like what counts as evidence, right? What counts as legitimate evidence, right? That you can build your theory on that's a different. I mean, that's not only about what questions we ask or what questions are worthwhile pursuing. Also, like how are we going to answer those questions, right? Those are what counts as a fact is going to be a contested topic, So. Well, thank you so much for the panel. Thank you so much for the audience. I learned a lot from all of you.